Delighted to have Kathy McCormick here today to uh, introduce our speaker, and she'll also be moderating the questions. So Kathy's a member of Encore Learning, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Laura. I'm very excited to be here and met Tony briefly last week, and I'm fascinated with his breadth of knowledge, and we're going to learn a lot today. Tony is an American businessman who's been living and working in Europe for the past 3 decades. He has over 30 years experience working with economies of Central Europe. And I think I will add that he's obviously an expert in the analysis of international relations. And I think you'll agree with me by the time the end of the talk. He has held senior leadership advisory and board positions at many US and European companies. He's the principal and owner of CGC Advisors, a strategic advisory and risk management consultancy, but he's also on the Atlantic Council, a senior fellow, and he's the co-founder of a charitable organization called Corporate Aid Ukraine that came out of his work with the American Chamber of Commerce, from which he has just stepped down as being the chair. The president. He was the president for the last 10 years, and he's still the chairman of their foundation. He's also very active in other military and humanitarian support issues related to Ukraine, and lives in Warsaw with his family and spends extra time in Belgium and Amsterdam. Tony, thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to the conversation. I'll be watching your questions.
Well, thank you, Kathy. It's great to be with Encore today. I commend Encore Learning for really trying to expand the envelope and thinking about what's going on around the world and bringing that direct conversation with a diverse group of stakeholders to people in your community. And so I'm really delighted to be here with you today. I would like to just open up a few comments with kind of maybe breaking things into 3 baskets for a few short comments. Then I'm happy to take some questions, but rather do it in baskets. And then at the end, if people have questions or want to tie things together, I'm more than happy to do that. But I wanted to start, as you see, with looking at the European Union, the EU and NATO, and the European Economic Area today. And then maybe a little bit more specifically later on the US-EU economic partnership. And then last but not least, looking at the security reality of the situation we face in Europe today with a partnership with the US vis-a-vis NATO, and looking at how the world has certainly changed over the last few years, but particularly the last 3 years since the second Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I would start with looking at where we're at today with the European Union and the perception that Europe has of the United States, but also the U.S. perception often of what's going on in Europe. And I think this is a significant area where there's a lot of misconception and sometimes information that is not exactly, let me put it this way, up to date. The relationship and the perception between the U.S. and the EU has, been constantly evolving in the last, 75 years since the end of the Second World War. But I think today it's more important than ever to really understand where we're at, respectively, as the United States and to some degree the NAFTA market, and the European Union and NATO. When we look at, what's going on in Europe, I always think, as it is in business, often as it is in investments, geopolitics, that perception lags significantly behind reality. And one of the things I'm continually struck by is the fact that as I meet with congressional delegations, members of successive U.S. administrations, when I'm here or when I'm in Washington or other places in Europe, that there seems to be a time lag which runs the risk of distorting the U.S. perception of the European Union and Europe as a whole. I would venture to say that in general, here in Europe, my experience in the last 35 years or so is that Europeans tend to be significantly better informed about what's going on in the US, our domestic politics, our strategic policies, the debates around those areas, and able to articulate opinions. And you don't have to agree with them. They may not always be perfectly informed, but significantly better informed than what we see from the US side in many cases. Now, of course, within the US, we have a tremendous amount of expertise, whether it be in the business world, the incredible people at the Department of State, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, that really have a great understanding of what our allies are doing, what the real reality is. But I think at a social level, there is some issue, and one of the things, and I'm sorry, I'm going to cheat and look at my phone because I made a note. Um, about 18 months ago, there was a Gallup poll in the US where 77% of Americans surveyed agreed with the idea that they had little or no knowledge about the European Union. And many of them were unable to name more than 5 European countries. That is not a great starting point for a true partnership discussion about our shared goals, about our shared values, about the common security issues that we face as the community of democratic nations. And so I think that this is a little bit of a start point I wanted to make, that within Europe, this is not your parents or grandparents' European Union or European community. And over the last, I would say, 20 years or so, um, I'm a little bit struck by the fact that many of the U.S. stakeholders I've met with repeatedly over that time uh, fail to understand that there has been an emerging European identity that goes far beyond just the European Union, but this identity that we're Europeans, that we have a common home, that we have a common future. Um, and there's been a number of things that have brought this about, that, um, and I'll tell a story and I won't name any names, but recently I was having dinner in Warsaw with a senior staff member from the US Congress and his elected officials, but he made the comment, this is the problem in Europe. I landed in Germany, somebody checked my passport. Now I've been in several countries and nobody's checked my passport. And then it struck me, this person in a foreign policy advisory position did not understand the Schengen Agreement, which is the borderless travel within a tight, controlled external border area. That's not a good signal when you think about, that his first thought was to complain about the lack of European controls and not even understanding that there is a agreement that's been in place since literally 1992 that eliminated some of the internal borders and allowed for visa-less, documentless travel. But when you enter or exit the Schengen area, it's like entering or exit the US. So this is one issue. Secondly, in the last 30 years, Europe has done a tremendous job of creating several programs for study, the Tempest program, the Erasmus program, which allow students to travel and study in other European countries. And they do that at the home cost. So there's no, quote, out-of-state tuition. You pay whatever local students pay. My son studied in the Netherlands. My older son studied there. And he paid what a Dutch student pays. Um, Same, we see increasingly a lot of students coming to Poland for medical and science degrees, and they pay what students pay here. So that mobility has helped create over the last 20, 25 years a very strong idea of a European home. And that, again, shapes the way that a generation now that, say, is under 50, 55, that sees the world differently. They see it much more as, of course, we're still Polish or French or German, but overriding that is a European idea. And whether that be in NATO, whether that be in the European Union, whether it even be wider to the European Economic Area, including Norway, Switzerland. So I think that this is something that has really changed generationally, and I don't always see that reflected in the conversations that I have with some of the U.S. stakeholders, that that's well understood. And I think the other thing I'd add on that is, though, that the U.S., despite changes or evolutions in confidence of American leadership, American commitment to Europe, American commitment to Article 5 within NATO, um, the U.S. is viewed very positively in general. U.S. society, U.S. citizens in general are viewed quite positive in Europe and continue to be so. But I think that this is something that again, uh, should be part of the American stewardship, of making sure that we do maintain, a level of goodwill with our European colleagues, and that they continue to see America as an engaged partner, a committed partner, a partner with shared values. Um, and I think at times we, run the danger of seeing that relationship damaged. Um, on top of that, I think that you see uh, uh, the approach, or if you will, pivot to Asia, sometimes not being very well understood here in Europe. And I'll touch more on that on the economic basket. But, the idea that, Europe and the US, certainly here in Europe, the view is, for the most part, I can't speak for everyone, of course, that this should be a common theme. This should be a common issue that we work with as the largest trade and investment bloc in the world. So I think that there's a lot in play. Certainly, the conflict in Ukraine with the Russian aggression there, and the strain that it's put on the relationship between Europe, and the U.S. Is something that is, seen as absolutely critical, here in Europe. But I think that the main point I wanted to make about this, current situation today is, you know, we are not in the view of 10 or 15 years ago, which seems to still predominate in some circles in US. I wouldn't say policy making, but policy observation, except for those people who are very much engaged on a weekly, monthly basis with Europe. So again, there's, I think, a lot to be optimistic about, but there are still a lot of challenges. And this new European identity, with free movement of labor, with European investment programs, European defense programs, et cetera, means that the Europe of today is indeed a different animal than many of us are used to having dealt with in the past. So on that first basket there, I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions, and then, or I can always move on to the economic basket.
We do have one question, a very good question from Ms. or Mr. Matos. I'm not sure. Thanks for your presentation today. As a child of a Foreign Service officer, I've been frustrated with U.S. media coverage of the EU and international news. I found and regularly watch Cipher Brief. Which other media outlets or columnists could you recommend that would help keep viewers, readers informed about EU politics and developments?
Well, I think, ideologies aside that some people might have, I would say, from a very broad mainstream view, I think Reuters, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal cover things quite well, particularly in depth. I would give a shout out to a good friend of mine, Dan Michaels, who writes out of Brussels for the Wall Street Journal, who is, covers a lot of things, particularly on aerospace and defense and different things that really have global impact in terms of their sectors, in terms of technology, in terms of security. So those are some as well. But I think the other thing too that I encourage people to do all the time is look, even if you do it once a week, just for a reality check. Le Monde, Dutch News, PL, De Telegraaf, any number of European, Le Figaro, any number of the European major outlets, have quite comprehensive English language sections. And I think it's once in a while good just to dip our fingers in and take a look. I read a lot of those on a regular basis, just to get the view, whether it's coming out of Rome, Paris, Madrid, Kiev, just to, see what, that view is there rather than a, American or Western European, generalist, overview is. So I think that's very good. And then, it may be a little bit controversial, but also once in a while, it's good to look at some of the people like Bellingcat or others to see some of their investigative work into what's going on in some parts of the world.
Kathy, you're muted right now, but we don't have any other. Oh,
I'm
wait.
sorry, we do have a couple more questions. Can I give them to you now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Lynn Jordan would like to know, do you sense a difference in the U.S. administration between current and prior players in level of understanding and level of efforts to gain better understanding? And then there's two more.
Well, on that one, I would say, I think you're trying to get me in trouble. No, I think it's not a question of trying to get understanding, but it's a question of what is the purpose of getting that understanding? Is it to understand and create an idea of, what's the best policy path forward, or is it just trying to understand how people are going to react to what we're going to do anyway?
Mhm.
And that's not unique to the current administration. In the previous administration, the first iteration of the current administration, and going back still further, sometimes, it really comes down to two baskets of the types of stakeholders you're dealing with. Those who are trying to understand the situation in order to craft the best outcome for the U.S. and or mutual, and those who are simply trying to understand the situation so they can best push through what they're going to do anyway. So I think it's a little bit more independent of which administration it is, but then the approach that a particular stakeholder has or what their mandate is.
Okay. Mary and Michael would like to both mention BBC and The Economist and ask if you'd recommend those. And then we have another question I'll share after that.
Well, certainly, I guess, the BBC and The Economist to some extent, I guess they're regular go-to sources of information. I think that the challenge with The Economist is one, paywalls for a lot of people, and secondly, their frequency of update is sometimes a little slower in terms of when they get around to covering kind of breaking trends, but that's still a fantastic source of information. And the BBC is really good, and I highly recommend BBC World Service online. Just as a streaming service to listen to, just to get a view, not just about what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the UK, and vis-a-vis that, but also around the world. It can be a little bit of an eye opener, to hear the different perspectives, particularly when they're talking from other places, in the Middle East, Africa, or Southeast Asia.
Okay. Stephen would like to know, as the EU copes with both aging populations and stronger anti-immigration attitudes, how might that affect their economic growth prospects and social safety net programs?
Well, I think it's certainly, will have an effect that, there's no doubt. And so how Europe over the next decade or so deals with immigration policy, will be important. I think that some of the backlash right now about immigration within Europe, is partially looking at the fact that some of the countries, and many people point to Germany in particular, kind of opening, if what many people would describe as the floodgates for kind of uncontrolled immigration and refugees, was not thought out in the sense of what is the societal impact that it has? What is the capacity of society to absorb that? And one of the things we see certainly in Poland, we see it in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, is, you know, traditionally, I think the idea for many people was that if people are seeking refuge and sanctuary and an opportunity in your country, that there is a willingness to work with the culture and the structures that exist within the country and the society. And I think there's a bit of a backlash because, we have seen in some European countries fairly recent immigrants demanding that their practices and culture be allowed, even if it, blocks streets in communities or different things. And these are not easy issues to deal with. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's no magic wand that provides a simple solution. But I do think that societies in Europe are certainly now having increasing amount of issues about, what are we doing to our own society, our structure? How do we cope with this? How do we integrate people, or do they want to be integrated? And I think that's a big debate that's going on right now. But demographically, it's very clear. Populations in Europe are declining, and there's going to need to be a significant, I think, modernization of the immigration policy. The question is, what will that immigration policy look like? What will be the requirements put on people to legally stay and settle in varying countries? And I think the other challenge too is that in Europe you have destination shopping.
Mm.
In in the US traditionally, there was the idea of dry feet, wet feet with regard to people fleeing Cuba. If you made it to shore, you got to stay. Well, in Europe, many people, we have a problem on the Poland-Belarus border, where we literally have Belarusian security forces providing ladders for people to breach the border fence to get over. But many of them, all they want to do is get to Germany because the benefit package is better.
Mm.
Uh, but at the same time, Poland and other countries in the Schengen zone have the responsibility to, protect the border. And there is no automatic right of moving on to another country. So there's, I think, many difficult discussions and decisions ahead about how Europe handles that. But the fact is, demographically, Europe will need more hands. Europe will need more taxpayers in order to be more sustainable. But also, I think it's a question too, and a lot of countries in Europe are looking very much at also what is the role of technology in dealing with some of the demographic collapse. That doesn't say we don't need more people, but looking at, how can we automate? How can we do things more effectively with fewer hands? But this will be and is and will continue to be, I think, one of the major social debates, over the next decade or so. And getting the decision right will be absolutely critical to the future of Europe.
Tony, I'm going to read the next two questions, then I think we probably should move on, but you can decide how you want to cover. One of them is the dated American view of Europe impacting policy in a real way? And the second one is getting into the current situation here. What is your opinion of the latest downsizing of the State Department?
Well, I think that anytime, you have information that may not currently reflect things, it's like forecasting the weather. If you have last week's weather forecast, it's hard to plan your picnic. And I think so understanding where Europe is at, what the political push and pull is within some of the major countries, and how that affects their leadership and their statements, how they respond to U.S. Initiatives, ideas, and policies, is very critical. But I do think that anytime you have a dated view it's certainly going to impact your ability to come to an effective outcome, whatever the subject is. So I think it does have a significant impact. I think that what I will say is many people I've spoke with in the last week or so from European foreign ministries throughout the region are concerned about about the reduction, the RIF in the State Department. I think there's the concern that while everyone in any government, has the right and indeed the responsibility to look at being as efficient as you can and using tax dollars or tax lira or whatever you're using effectively. I think, the concern is, are certain limited talent pools, being let go, because a lot of the specialized knowledge, a lot of the specialized understanding and capability, and indeed the relationships, these are not something that can just be automatically replicated and just taken over by somebody who doesn't have exposure to that. So I do think that it's an area of concern. And I think that from people I've spoken to in a number of foreign ministries over the last week or 10 days, has been they're still kind of waiting to see how that is distributed, which areas that are important, to them, their particular countries, their regions, their areas, have been, significantly impacted. But I still think that many of as I have read, much of the growth in the employment base, over the last 10 years or so had been in local national hires. And so whether that's also going to be affected as well, because I worked in multiple countries with the local national staff, as subject matter experts in various economic, technical, and military areas, and whether they'll be as impacted as the Foreign Service and U.S. headquarters-based staff. I mean, I guess that remains to be seen. But certainly, it's an area of concern, I think, for a lot of people that are interested in strong U.S. engagement.
Okay, are you ready to go on then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, so I wanted to touch a little bit on the U.S. EU economic partnership, and if I might ask, there's like I had one more slide there. Yeah, just looking at a few context, numbers. Looking at the fact that there's actually 100 million more European Union citizens than there are U.S. citizens. But I wanted you to look at this, look at that difference. I think that's also a little bit important too, that one of the things we hear frequently from people that talk down a little bit on the European Union, they look at GDP nominal. And yes, there's a big difference. But when you look at PPP, purchasing power parity, it's essentially the same. But that also doesn't, at those baseline numbers, doesn't necessarily reflect the fact, that the European Union since 2004, has absorbed a number of significantly less wealthy countries. So, that's reflected, in what that PPP looks like. However, some of the fastest growing economies in the world are here in Central Europe. So while some of the countries like France and Germany and Spain may be experiencing very slow economic growth and, just tricking above, zero, to, 0.4, 0.5, sometimes 1%, you have countries, like Poland, the Baltic countries, Romania, that, are clocking at 3.5, 4, sometimes 5% GDP growth, year on year. And looking at trade, this is one of the points too, that the U.S. and the United States are the largest trade and investment relationship in the world, dwarfing China and anyone else. So, looking at US EU trade, 1.4 trillion in goods and services. And, the US trade deficit, is about 1.25 billion, but it's 350 billion in goods because we don't build that much stuff in America anymore. But because the US has a massive trade surplus in services, it draws that down to about 1.25 billion. And as you see there below, goods, 19%, so basically a fifth of all goods in the world moved are between the US and the EU, and a quarter in services, and literally close to half of global foreign direct investment is between the US and the EU. So it's a massively important economic relationship. The idea of a trade war is certainly not welcome among business. It's certainly not welcome among most, political leaders. And, the question has to be, who will this serve? Will it bring a rapid return of U.S. manufacturing back? It takes time to rebuild manufacturing that was sold off over 20 or 30 years. So I think, the goal may be admirable to reinvigorate U.S. manufacturing and have critical materials and equipment available from domestic sources in the U.S. But one, it's not going to happen overnight, and the risk of disruption is significant. So I think that this is just a little start point I would make about where where things are from a business and economic point of view. But what I would also like to point out is that, when we look at, one of the big narratives that, we've heard for multiple administrations. I mean, going back, I can recall, back to I'm not even sure how you say it, the tens, the teens, the whatever it is, before 2010 and after, is about the lack of innovation in Europe, the lack of champions, in Europe. And that is true. That's something that sort of hindered the approach of Europe being able to, deal at times on an equal basis with the U.S. in some areas. However, I just kind of throw back and point out that, many of the technologies that we use every day when we're in the US or in Europe, but looking at it from a US perspective, are European. And so while US companies may build on them, they may improve on them, I think it is important to remember that while the US is an incredibly innovative society, and it rewards risk-taking and the creation of, technology giants, GSM phones, so all the digital phones you use, that's a US invention. I'm sorry, a European invention. SIM cards, the SMS system, the text message, that was all developed in Europe. The 3-point safety belt is from Europe. Radars from Europe. Alexa, I don't know how many of you have Alexa in your home or know people who do, but Alexa was developed in Poland. Its original name was Ivona. And the whole Alexa project is built off of a small company that Amazon bought here in Poland in 2013. The little box you get in the corner of your computer when you're trying to shop online, live chat, it's a European technology. mRNA vaccines are largely a European technology. Bulletproof vests, DNA sequencing, IVF, the CD, the DVD, jet engines, the World Wide Web, soft contact lenses. So the narrative that Europe can't innovate is something I think, again, that we, from a US perspective, we push that narrative at our own risk. Now, I think U.S. companies often, in the environment, the ability to scale, make it so they can go to market faster, be larger. But the idea that Europe is not innovative, I think, is far. And I actually have an entirely second page of those things, but I decided I won't bother you with them. Um, so I think that this is something that we need to look at, carefully, and also U.S. investments in Europe uh, are tremendously helpful to the bottom line for our American corporates. But more importantly, they're terribly important on helping drive economic success, stock market numbers and ratios, because success of European companies in Europe that are public in the US, that helps also support all of our pension funds. I've had multiple meetings over the years here in Europe, with CalPERS and firefighters unions and all sorts of. They're looking. Hey, we want to understand the funds we work with are recommending we invest here, we invest here. What's going on. So when they see success of American companies in this part of the world, in Europe, in Central Europe, then they feel better about, where they're putting their members' money, or allowing those decisions to be made. So the success of U.S. investments in Europe takes nothing away from the ability to grow jobs and create jobs in the U.S. Here you're in a different regulatory environment. You're behind a certain amount of tariff wall right now. Hopefully it won't get larger. But I think the other thing too to look at is that, right now, literally, I think it's 2/3, don't quote me, but I think 2/3 of all the larger BMW SUVs built in the world, they're built in the Carolinas and exported all over the world. Airbuses are assembled in, I think it's Alabama or Mississippi. Um, we have, Volkswagen and Audi and Mercedes, all these brands, investing, manufacturing, assembling, providing jobs, throughout the U.S., as U.S. companies are doing throughout Europe. So this intertwined relationship is absolutely critical, and I think to uh, 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 risk damaging that um, will not pay dividends either in the short term or the medium term. Um, I do agree that there are areas where there are some discriminatory issues for U.S. companies in Europe in a few areas, but that also goes the other way. So I think that if you look at what is your largest wealth generating relationship, it's critical that policymakers on both sides, in Brussels and in Washington, as well as some of the key European capitals, keep that in mind, that we have a tremendously beneficial economic relationship, a very symbiotic international relationship, and that we should be guarding it and enhancing it, rather than risk damaging it while the rest of the world looks on, frankly, in glee. So I'll stop there for Kathy and see if anyone has any questions.
We have some good questions. Thank you. I want to point out that Michael earlier endorsed the Economist, and he believes that many Europeans read it. But he has another question, and it is, what is the European perception of U.S. support for Article 5?
Well, I think thankfully Article 5 has been carved in stone long enough. I think that most Europeans believe that the U.S. Will honor Article 5. Of course, there have been some seesaw statements, back and forth at the highest levels, about, well, whether Article 5 applies to everybody all the time, et cetera. But I think at the end of the day, as long as there are U.S. forces in Europe, as long as there are strategic U.S. interests in Europe, that Article 5 will continue to be a key element of U.S. national policy and power. Because without Article 5, our influence in a big part of the world is diminished. And so the solidity of Article 5 is vital for U.S. national interest. And I think most Europeans, understand that, it's a two-way street. It's not just a security guarantee, if you will, for NATO members, but it's also a statement of the U.S. on the global stage that it is the power projection country on the planet.
Thank you very much. Patricia would like to ask, can you discuss the acceptance and/or use of cryptocurrency in the EU?
Well, that's a very new thing for an old dog like me. However, cryptocurrency is certainly used a lot in civil society. There are discussions at the European Union level about regulating, recognizing that, or the utility potentially of tying some government financial institutions to cryptocurrency, but more likely vice versa, tying some of the cryptocurrency to those, kind of like an old-fashioned euro dollar bond or something like that. But I think that there are multiple cryptocurrencies operating in Europe, as there are lots of kind of purely digital banks that cross borders. But I think that Europe takes a little bit more reserved approach to cryptocurrency than I think that seems to be emerging in the U.S. But I think it's also widely recognized at the EU level. Look, it's here to stay. How do we protect consumers? How do we protect markets that want to use this financial instrument? And I think what we'll ultimately have to see as well is some sort of discussion, of course, on a transatlantic basis between our very intertwined economies about how we treat cryptocurrency, same as how we deal with AI regulation and control of data and various things. So this will be another conversation that will have to be had. But I would say cryptocurrency is here to stay with us, certainly in Europe. I just think that my sense is that the European Commission will take a little bit more measured approach to it. And one thing to keep in mind too is that some of the European countries, have been less quick to embrace new mechanical, in the sense, old-fashioned financial instruments. You know, Here in Central Europe, I can recall, gosh, early 2000s, we had a lot of people over from the US talking to the financial regulators throughout Central Europe, and as well as talking to banks in the region about this packaging mortgages. And literally to a core, every single central bank, every single Ministry of Finance said, no thanks, this sounds like really risky stuff. And then a few years later, we had 2008 unleashed in the US. So I think that in general, there's a slightly more conservative approach to financial instruments here in Europe than in the US.
Okay, we're going to move to Brexit. Sandra would like to ask you, how did Brexit impact Europe and what is the UK role and relationship with Europe?
Well, what a simple, short question that is. No, look, Brexit, I think most people, except those people who are ideologically driven, recognize Brexit as a event that never should have happened. I will tell you a little story. In 2017, 18, I guess it was just before the pandemic, whenever that was, 2018, I think. I was actually privileged to be included in a dinner here in Poland with David Cameron. And so he made the comment, well, look, I'm here, ask me anything you want. And people ask a few very general questions. I thought, well, this is boring. So I said, well, Mr. Cameron, why? And his response was, without even asking why what, was, we never thought we would lose. So you saw, it's like, what a political miscalculation. And I know I'm back and forth to the UK on a very regular basis, pre and post Brexit. And, literally, just from a personal point of view, I can tell you dozens of business owners I know, they moved pre-Brexit, were moving their businesses to the continent. So they still keep a business in the UK for their local stuff, but for their European business, they moved out, whether it be production, distribution, manufacturing. Um, so I think, the impact on the UK is significant. And as we see now, the UK is trying to claw back some of that and do it in a way that's not politically damaging to the government, though I don't see how they manage that. To whether it's the Defense Pact signed, I think, we're going to see more at least short-term right of residence and work for EU citizens restored a little bit more easily. I think they're trying to figure out how do they claw back some of the losses from Brexit. To me, it's one of the saddest things in the last 30 years I've seen in Europe, to see this self-inflicted wound. And also see the loss of UK leadership within the EU. When I was a graduate student doing EU economics and defense in the early 90s in Belgium, uh, our constitutional law professor, who is now the head of the European Court of Justice, said the two worst members of the European community were the UK and Denmark in terms of noise they made. The two best in actually incorporating European community directives and regulations into practice were the same two countries. So they both Denmark, which has thankfully stayed in the UK had leadership roles to play, and I think Europe is poorer for it, and definitely the UK is poorer for Brexit. They seem to be trying to mend the relationship, but if the Reform Party should be able to form a government at some point in the future, then I expect that will end.
I have one more question before we move on to security issues, but Charlie would like to know, he's very curious. You mentioned the World Wide Web as a European innovation. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, Sir Tim was in the UK. He developed the protocol along with a Belgian computer scientist that actually, created the data packaging system for the World Wide Web. Now, BitNet in the US was the forerunner of the World Wide Web. And actually, funny enough, worked for BitNet as an intern for back in the mid 80s when you had lots of phones on receivers and they said things like Cal Berkeley and Sandia National, and you actually had to respond to things that went beep beep and move the handles around so that the carrier waves could talk to each other. But the actual protocol for the World Wide Web to actually make that interchange possible was all done in Europe.
And you were referring to someone named Tim Berners-Lee, is that right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I don't remember the Belgian guy's name off the top of my head, and that's bad because having lived in Belgium, I should be more have a better memory for the Flemish names.
Peggy has put it in here. It's Switzerland. Would that be his name? Oh, Tim was Swiss. Tim was Swiss.
No, Tim was from the UK.
Okay, okay. Well, let's move on to your next section. And then we can get back to all the questions as they develop. Thank you.
Well, I would just touch, on the security reality, that we face, here in Europe today. Um, you know, I, it's a challenge at times to discuss because a lot of the politics around um, the situation in Ukraine with Russia, um, with some U.S. stakeholders. But the fact of the matter is, we have a major war going on, bordering the European Union, bordering NATO. Um, it's next door to the country I live in. Based on my travels, I regularly check my app, which tells me, what the situation looks like right now. Uh, it's not the worst right now, but here's a map. I don't know if you can see it. Here's a map of Ukraine. See all this stuff in red? That's where there's active air raid warnings at this very minute. Some is artillery, some is drone, some is airstrike, and some is ballistic missile. It's all right there. It's a beautiful app. Works very well, and it's something that many people, when we're traveling there, we rely on to try to keep safe. But that's a reality, here in Europe today, and the response, of Europe and the United States on the one hand has been, good to support Ukraine, its ability to defend itself. However, you know, the question always comes down to, are we doing enough to help them continue to fight? Or are we doing enough to help them bring the war to some sort of resolution that's acceptable, that preserves a free, democratic Ukraine and a viable territory? Um, and, but part of the result of that has been, that there's a massive rearmament program beginning in Europe. We see the latest agreement now between the U.S., European allies, and Ukraine, that the European allies will pay for some of the U.S. weapons in addition to their own to be provided to Ukraine. Um, and some countries are quite ahead of the game. Certainly the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, Sweden, Finland, been taking this very seriously for more than a decade. Um, and it was quite interesting when the Secretary of Defense was here on his first foreign trip after Inauguration Day, that you know he had to concede that Poland spends more of its GDP per capita on defense than the U.S. does. So Poland is the leading defense spender, in NATO, um, and uh, but that's just a reflection of the clear and present danger that Poland and our Baltic neighbors and Finland, Sweden, Romania, in particular, see in the Russian threat. So it's a very different threat perception, I think, sometimes than one experiences. In 2014, I was speaking at a event in Paris, and a French MP said about the Crimea invasion, "That's a long way away." And I told him, that's a matter of where you live. It's in the country next door to me. So I think that if we get too siloed in our geographies, our security of being across the Atlantic Ocean, et cetera, that can sometimes take away from our real perception of the threat. Um, but I think the other key issue too is that uh, uh, the nature of warfare, as we've seen defined in the Ukraine over the last 39 months, shows us that we have to be not just in the U.S. but in Europe, that we have to be agile in our thinking. We have to ensure that our defense industrial base as well as our related civilian industrial base, is able to provide us the tools we need to deter and, if need be, defend our sovereign nations and our alliance. And I think this is something that it's a wake-up call to the defense industrial sector in Europe and in the US, that we can't let perfect be the enemy of good in terms of systems, in terms of ability to produce, in terms of providing resiliency and redundancy. And that's not just in our pure defense systems, but here in Europe on some of the programs I work with, and we've taken some lessons from Ukraine, is looking at how do we keep the power on, how do we keep the cash machines running, how do we keep the data networks up and running, all these things which are relatively easy targets, but at the same time, if we lose control of them or lose the ability to provide them, can be damaging not only to an ability to defend the country, to maintain the economy, but also to maintain civil society and trust in leadership and authority. So I think there's a lot of work ahead, and this is the new security reality that we're in. I don't think that there are many people today in leadership positions in armed forces, except for a small handful that I'm aware of, that really could have foreseen how quickly, the security situation, the type of warfare that could be waged, how fast that could change. And so, this is has to be a eureka moment for policymakers and decision makers. And I think certainly in Europe, and I wonder if it's not true sometimes, in other democratic countries as well, is that policymakers are a little bit afraid to ring the bell and really explain, how things have changed and what the risks are. We have seen, cyber attacks. We've seen, here in Poland, we undergo constant cyber attacks from Russia, and to some extent North Korea and China, and it's continuous. I mean, our cyber command is in Poland. It's engaged in combat 24 hours a day. And trying to protect critical networks. So is the civilian national computer response team. So, we have Chinese ships dragging anchors to cut power cables and communications cables in the Baltic. We have Russian incursions into NATO airspace. We have Russian fighters and aircraft flying without transponders, literally on the airspace borders. So, we live in a little bit different environment, certainly here in Eastern Europe, or Central Europe, as most people would call it, but the eastern part of NATO, than I think is realized even sometimes by our European friends, but certainly in the U.S. So it's a different reality, and we are pleased, I think, here in this part of the world. When I consider myself a resident of this part of the world, we have strong U.S. engagement. We have 11,000 U.S. troops on the ground here in Poland. Armor Brigade Combat Team, rotational forces, air detachments, munition storage. So, I mean, we're pleased with the U.S. engagement and the participation. But I think sometimes if you go outside of the House and Senate Intelligence and Armed Forces committees and the military leadership, you get a different understanding of what the actual situation here is, if you will, on kind of the eastern flank.
So there are some questions here. One is a real quick question. What's the name of the app with the map of Ukraine? Would you be willing to share that?
Wow, I've had it on so long that it's called, yeah, it's called, you can find it on map.ukrainealarm.com.
Alarm.com. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so
Got
it's
that.
a real time. Oh, now looks like we have yeah, we have seaborne attack coming in from the Black Sea as well right now. So that's evolved.
Wow. Map.ukrainealarm.com. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. The other thing,
And I think the app itself is called Air Alert with
air
an
alert.
exclamation mark.
Okay, got that? Great. Thank you very much. Um, okay, here's a tough one. Is Trump compromised by Putin? And then I have two other complex questions too.
If I knew the answer to that, I would write a book one way or the other. Um, uh, 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 so I mean, it's such a general question. I can't comment on that. What I can say is that the evolution of the relationship between President Trump and Mr. Putin, I think just shows what a complex world we live in. But I am more pleased than not about where that relationship seems to be going. That I think it starts to now move from reflecting a hope to a reflection of reality.
Okay, thank you. Patricia has mentioned that Poles have been very generous in taking in refugees from Ukraine. And how is this affecting Poland's economy and social demographics? And to add a phrase to that, in general, how is Poland affected by all of this? But she's specifically focusing on the economy and the social demographics. Taking
Well, at one point, Poland had almost 4 million Ukrainian displaced people. That number now, I believe, is around 1.6 million. Some have returned to Ukraine, particularly to the western regions of Ukraine. Some have moved on to other European countries. Um, there is, I think it's fair to say, there is a modest amount of fatigue in civil society on it. But on general, Ukrainians are welcome still. Hundreds of thousands, I think over 800,000 are uh, new permanently registered, in the workforce, all the paperwork and everything. Then, of course, you have a lot of children because in many cases it was only the vast majority. It was only the females who were able to leave um, with the children. Um, economically, it's been beneficial for Poland. We relied on before the February 22 invasion. We relied on 1.5 million Ukrainian people working here in Poland to do all sorts of things from high skill jobs down to very low skill jobs. And since uh, 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 February 22, that number has gone up significantly. And so I think overall it's been beneficial to Poland. But that's one hand, if you will, kind of the economic, benefit, more hands, more people to help deal with some of the labor shortages. But I think what is critical to think about is that immediately upon the outbreak of the war and the flood of Ukrainian displaced people coming, into Poland, the government of Poland provided them with status, papers, access to the education system, access to the labor market, access to the healthcare system. It's I am not aware of, in recent times, any movement of millions of people like that, where a country, a smaller country than the bigger country, has provided that level of official status. So there was never any tent cities, refugee camps. In the early days, I mean, in the very early days, I was back and forth, to the border. We had some friends, some colleagues, family members, to picking them up at the border, whether with us or with friends or finding them, apartments, places to stay, et cetera, till they could get on their feet. But their ability and their anxiousness to begin to work, to, not just be a charity case, to be a handout. Um, but as former Ambassador Brzezinski here, said, Poland demonstrated, that it was a humanitarian superpower, by doing this, in such a manner. And I think that also, though, had a big effect on how civil society reacted. It was a welcoming, it was, you can do the things you have to do, and there will be some assistance for you, but you also need to get on and, to the extent you can, get your kids in school, get a job, do some, or there's ways to register for, assistance. Um, so, it's tremendous, and, it's still going on today, but thankfully, to a lesser extent, as we've seen quite a few people return to Ukraine when they realize that, Ukraine will stand strong, and will not surrender. So I've got plenty of people that I was with, in March of 22 that, they're now back in Kiev or, Lviv or Ivanko. They've gone back to work, they've gone back to their families, they've gone back, to get their kids in school. Um, Poland has certainly been affected, but I would say largely on a positive basis. But I think it's also been a tremendous experience for Polish civil society to, go from, 35 years ago being the economic basket case of Europe to being able to provide, aid and assistance to millions of refugees or displaced people from a neighboring country.
Thank you for enlightening us about that. That's really, it's such a positive. There's a question here now about Gaza. 25 European and other countries, including Canada and Japan, just issued a joint statement that the war against Gaza must end. Where do you see this going? Bill is asking that question.
Well, I wish I could tell Bill I had some sort of answer for that. I think that for a lot of the European countries, it's a question of what they would like to see happen, but do they have any ability to affect what's actually going to happen? And I think, unfortunately, in the case of Gaza, this is a case of realpolitik versus desire. And so I would like to be, more optimistic that there is a way for Europe to have a stronger impact to ensure that we get to some sort of peace and end of the conflict. However, I think that's largely down to the government of Mr. Netanyahu, rather than Mr. Macron or anyone else.
Mhm. It's a tough one. Another question that came up is related to data centers. We hear lots and lots of talk about that in this area. Is Europe also facing challenges with data centers being built and draining local resources?
Well, I think people are beginning to understand just how much in terms of resources, these major data centers take. Um, so I'm actually involved in a data center project myself, and one of the things that, we looked at was really being realistic and saying, where could this data center potentially go? Well, it's actually a series of data centers, kind of it's a cluster that technically makes up one large data center. But looking at, okay, we're looking at Poland, a couple other countries in Central Europe, but literally when we came down to where would it have the least impact, in terms of doing the, robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. We basically looked at the initial area and we came down to around 10% of the total land area where there would be sufficient water, power, land area without significant degradation, and also, human capital. And so I think that my sense is that based on my experience of this particular project, but also others that are going on, is that there's a relatively systemic way of looking at how to place these necessary, data centers for economic security and growth, but not necessarily put them in places where they're going to overly strain resources and capabilities. And I have seen a few cases looking at in the US, and there was also one I was looking at over in the Iberian Peninsula, where you're just thinking, why would you put it there? There's no water. You're going to just stop farming, or so I think that there seems to be in much of Europe a pretty rational view toward looking at it, but there's still that very strong impulse that these projects need to move forward in order for economic competitiveness to be maintained.
Right. We don't have any other questions that are in the question and answer section. Is there anything you'd like to sum up with or add?
No, I would just say, thanks for the opportunity to chat with the Encore audience. I hope that there's at least been one or two potential useful nuggets of information. But I would just say, if anyone takes any message away from it, is the United States has no better friend than the European Union.
Oh, that's good
And
news.
we, on both sides of the Atlantic, need to remind ourselves of it and remind everyone else of it, because we are indeed stronger together. And so I hope that if people would take anything away from this discussion this evening, is that we have much more to gain by working together than we do by working separately.
I see some thanks in the Q&A for you, Tony, and I'll say for everybody else, I'm really appreciative of what we've learned and for your taking time with us. And I know Laura's going to add to that. Thank you. It's been great working with you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah,
My
thank you
pleasure.
so much, Tony. And as you pointed out, this evening, for you, it is evening. And we're just so fortunate to do a virtual event where we can bring in somebody live from Warsaw. Really incredible. And I've known Tony for almost
Don't
40
say it.
years. No. So it's a pleasure to connect with you and appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all. Have a great evening. And again, keep it up. I think this is a tremendously valuable platform, and really appreciate all that you do.
In a few years, when you retire, you can teach a class for us.
Oh gosh, well, I still have kids in university, so I won't be retiring anytime soon.
All right.
But
Sounds good.
but I'm happy to help any way I can, anytime. So all the best. Thank you all so much.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye bye.